1983. The world crowned David Bowie as the king of pop. 10 million copies sold. MTV's Golden Child. Stadium tours, magazine covers, everything an artist could dream of. But behind the pastel suits and the choreographed dance moves, Bowie was waking up every night in cold sweat, asking himself one terrifying question: who have I become? This is the story of how commercial success almost destroyed one of music's greatest chameleons. How a collaboration meant to save his career made him question whether he'd sold his soul. And why, decades later, Bowie would call this period one of his deepest regrets. Before we dive into this untold chapter of rock history, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths behind music legends, subscribe to our channel. Because what happened to Bowie in the 80s wasn't just about one album. It was about the price every artist pays when they choose relevance over authenticity. To understand why Let's Dance felt like betrayal, you need to understand where Bowie was before it. From 1976 to 1979, he'd lived in Berlin, creating what many consider his most artistically pure work. The Berlin trilogy, Low, Heroes, Lodger. These weren't albums designed to sell. They were sonic experiments, collaborations with Brian Eno that pushed rock music into avant-garde territories most mainstream audiences couldn't comprehend. The albums were critically adored, but commercially modest. Heroes sold around 1 million copies globally, respectable, but nothing compared to his Ziggy Stardust era. More importantly, Bowie was clean for the first time in years, having escaped the cocaine psychosis that nearly killed him in Los Angeles. Berlin had been his monastery, his rehabilitation center, his artistic rebirth. He rode bicycles through gray streets, painted in his apartment, and made music that prioritized innovation over hooks. But there was a problem. By 1981, Bowie was nearly broke. His former manager had embezzled massive amounts of money. The experimental albums, while artistically successful, hadn't generated the revenue needed to sustain his lifestyle or financial obligations. He had a son, Duncan, to think about. He had debts. And more pressingly, he had a creeping fear that was beginning to haunt him in the middle of the night. The fear wasn't about money. It was about irrelevance. Punk rock had arrived in 1976, declaring Bowie and his generation dinosaurs. New wave was fragmenting into dozens of subgenres. MTV had launched in 1981, and suddenly, music wasn't just about sound anymore. It was about visuals, about youth, about constant reinvention in 3-minute packages. At 35 years old, Bowie was watching younger artists dominate the conversation. Duran Duran, Culture Club. Artists who, ironically, had been directly influenced by Bowie's gender-bending theatricality, were now being positioned as the new wave, while he was being relegated to inch veteran status. In interviews from 1982, you can hear the tension in his voice. When asked about his place in contemporary music, he'd deflect, joke, change the subject. But friends noticed something darker. Bowie was afraid. Not the paranoid fear of his cocaine years, but something more existential. He was afraid of becoming a nostalgia act, forever touring on Ziggy Stardust's legacy while the present moved on without him. But here's what nobody understood at the time. What wouldn't become clear until years later. Bowie wasn't just afraid of irrelevance. He was afraid that his artistic purity in Berlin had been a form of hiding. That by making deliberately uncommercial music, he'd been protecting himself from having to compete in the mainstream again. And that fear, the fear that maybe he couldn't connect with a mass audience anymore, was eating him alive. So when his new manager suggested working with Nile Rodgers, the genius behind Chic's disco empire and producer of records that had dominated dance floors worldwide, Bowie said yes. Not enthusiastically at first, but pragmatically. He needed a hit. He needed to prove he could still matter to more than just critics and art students. What he didn't know was that this decision would create an internal war that would define the rest of the decade. Nile Rodgers received the call in late 1982. David Bowie wanted to work with him. For Rodgers, this was surreal. He'd grown up admiring Bowie, seeing him as untouchable royalty in the rock pantheon. But there was also confusion. Why would the man who made Heroes, an album that deliberately rejected commercial formulas, want to work with someone known for creating irresistible pop hooks? Their first meeting happened at the Carlyle Hotel in New York. Bowie played Rodgers a demo. The song was called Let's Dance. But the version Rodgers heard that day wasn't the Let's Dance the world would come to know. It was slower, more introspective, with a darker undertone. It sounded, in Rodgers' words, like a folk song played in a cave. Rodgers listened politely. Then he asked Bowie a direct question. What do you actually want from this record? There was a long pause. Bowie looked out the hotel window at the New York skyline. When he finally answered, his response was revealing. I want a hit. I want to prove I can still do this. Not, I want to make great art. Not, I want to push boundaries. He wanted a hit. And in that moment, Rodgers understood his mandate. He wasn't being hired to help Bowie make another experimental masterpiece. He was being hired to make David Bowie commercially relevant again. But here's where the story gets complicated, where the knot of artistic compromise begins to tighten. Bowie didn't just want a hit. He wanted a massive hit. He wanted to obliterate any question about his commercial viability. And to do that, he was willing to do something he'd never really done before in his career. Follow someone else's vision. Rodgers took Let's Dance and transformed it. He sped up the tempo, added his signature guitar funk, brought in session musicians who could create that glossy, radio-friendly sound that MTV was devouring. He recruited Stevie Ray Vaughan, a virtually unknown Texas blues guitarist, to add searing solos that would give the pop sheen some rock credibility. The arrangements became tighter, more structured, more predictable in the best commercial sense. During the recording sessions at Power Station Studios in New York, Bowie was enthusiastic, collaborative, trusting. But people who were there noticed something subtle. Between takes, when Rodgers was arranging horn sections or adjusting the mix, Bowie would stand alone by the window, smoking, staring out at nothing in particular. Tony Visconti, Bowie's longtime producer who wasn't involved in this project, visited one day and later said, David looked like he was at his own funeral, but trying to smile through it. The album came together quickly. 8 songs recorded in 3 weeks. Modern Love, China Girl, Criminal World, all polished, all radio ready, all designed for maximum commercial impact. The production was immaculate. Rodgers had delivered exactly what he'd been hired to deliver. A David Bowie album that sounded contemporary, accessible, and undeniably catchy. When they finished mixing, Rodgers was ecstatic. He knew they'd created something that would be massive. Bowie listened to the final version in the control room, surrounded by engineers and session musicians waiting for his reaction. He said it was perfect. He smiled. He shook hands. He thanked everyone. But that night, alone in his apartment, Bowie called his friend Iggy Pop in Berlin. The conversation lasted 2 hours. What was said remained private for years, but Iggy later revealed one detail. Bowie kept asking the same question over and over. Is this still me? Tell me this is still me. Let's Dance was released on April 14, 1983. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The title track shot to #1 in multiple countries. The album sold 500,000 copies in its first week. MTV put the video on heavy rotation. Bowie dancing in the Australian outback, surrounded by Aboriginal imagery, wearing a pastel blue suit that became instantly iconic. By summer, Let's Dance had sold over 10 million copies worldwide. It was Bowie's biggest commercial success by a massive margin. The Serious Moonlight tour sold out stadiums across the globe. Press coverage was unanimous in declaring Bowie's triumphant return. At 36 years old, he was suddenly bigger than he'd been even during the Ziggy Stardust mania. Everyone was celebrating. His record label, EMI, was ecstatic. His manager was vindicated. Nile Rodgers had cemented his reputation as someone who could make anyone a commercial force. The world had its proof. David Bowie was still relevant, still vital, still capable of dominating popular culture. Except Bowie himself wasn't celebrating. In interviews during the tour, journalists noticed a strange disconnect. When asked about the album's success, he'd give polite, almost rehearsed answers about being grateful and excited. But when asked about his next artistic direction, his answers became vague, uncertain, almost defensive. In a Rolling Stone interview from July 1983, the reporter noted, "Bowie seems uncomfortable with his own success, as if he's waiting for permission to stop smiling." When pressed about whether he'd continue in this commercial direction, Bowie said something revealing. "I've proven I can do this, but I don't know if I want to keep proving it." But here's what was really happening, what Bowie couldn't articulate publicly at the time. He was experiencing a unique form of artistic crisis. He hadn't failed. He'd succeeded spectacularly, and that success felt like a trap closing around him. Behind the scenes, the pressure was intensifying. EMI wanted another Let's Dance immediately. His management wanted to capitalize on the momentum. Tour promoters were offering unprecedented amounts of money for extended stadium runs. Everyone around him had the same message. You found the formula. Don't change it. Keep giving people what they want. And that's when the nightmares started. Multiple people from Bowie's inner circle in 1983 and '84 have mentioned, in various interviews over the years, that he was sleeping poorly. He'd wake up in hotels during the Serious Moonlight tour, disoriented, unsure which city he was in. But it wasn't just typical tour exhaustion. Friends said he seemed haunted by something deeper. Carlos Alomar, his longtime guitarist who played on both the Berlin albums and Let's Dance, was one of the few people Bowie opened up to during this period. In a later interview, Alomar revealed a conversation they'd had backstage in Los Angeles. Bowie had just played to 70,000 people, received standing ovations, done everything perfectly. But afterward, in his dressing room, he turned to Alomar and said, "I feel like I'm playing someone else's songs, like I'm a David Bowie impersonator." Alomar asked him what he meant. Bowie struggled to explain. Finally, he said, "In Berlin, when we made Heroes, I had no idea if anyone would like it. I didn't care. I was making it for some reason I can't even name, but it felt necessary. This," he gestured vaguely at the stadium beyond the walls, "this feels optional. Like I'm choosing to be someone the audience wants, rather than discovering who I actually am." And here's the devastating realization that was beginning to crystallize in Bowie's mind. The commercial success of Let's Dance hadn't validated his artistic worth. It had revealed how easily he could manufacture it. And if he could manufacture it this easily, what did that say about all his previous artistic statements? Had any of it really mattered? This is the crisis nobody talks about when they discuss artistic compromise. It's not just about selling out. It's about succeeding at selling out, and then having to live with the knowledge that you're very good at giving people what they want, instead of challenging them with what you need to express. If Bowie had stopped there, if Let's Dance had been a one-time commercial experiment before returning to more adventurous work, the story might have ended differently. But that's not what happened. Instead, caught in the machinery of success, afraid to step off the ride he'd just proven he could dominate, Bowie made a decision that he'd regret for decades. He decided to do it again, and again, and again. Tonight, released in 1984, was Let's Dance's sequel in the worst possible way. It took the commercial formula and amplified it, making everything louder, shinier, more radio-friendly. But something crucial was missing. Where Let's Dance had at least retained some of Bowie's idiosyncratic charisma, tonight felt generic, calculated, empty. Critics savaged it. Even commercial audiences who'd adored Let's Dance seemed uncertain. But the album still went platinum. Tours still sold out. So Bowie kept going, trapped in what he'd later call his Phil Collins years, a period where he was chasing commercial relevance so desperately that he'd lost track of what made him relevant in the first place. Never Let Me Down, released in 1987, was the nadir. It featured synthesizers that sounded dated the moment they were recorded, lyrics that felt phoned in, production that was trying so hard to sound contemporary that it bypassed contemporary and landed in parody. One critic wrote, "David Bowie has finally achieved what we all thought was impossible. He's made himself boring." But here's the truly tragic element. Bowie knew it was happening. He wasn't oblivious. He was watching himself in real time become the thing he'd always feared. A caricature, a brand, a nostalgia act wearing modern clothes. In his 1987 diary entries, which weren't published until years after his death, Bowie wrote extensively about his state of mind during this period. One entry from March of that year is particularly revealing. Listen to the new album today. Professionally recorded, professionally performed, professionally empty. When did I become so afraid of scaring people? When did I decide that being liked was more important than being necessary? The Glass Spider Tour, supporting Never Let Me Down, was a massive production. Enormous sets, theatrical elements, dancers, choreography. It looked like a triumph from the outside. But people who worked on the tour described a strange atmosphere. Bowie would perform each night flawlessly, hitting every mark, singing every note perfectly. But between shows, he'd retreat completely, barely speaking to anyone, spending hours alone in his dressing room or hotel suite. Peter Frampton, who played guitar on the tour, later said, "It felt like David was fulfilling a contract with himself. Like he'd promised someone he'd be this mainstream pop star, and he was determined to see it through, even though it was killing something inside him." And that contract, that unspoken agreement Bowie had made with commercial success, was suffocating him. Because here's the paradox he was trapped in. The more successful he became at being commercially relevant, the less relevant he felt to himself. And the less relevant he felt to himself, the more desperately he tried to prove his commercial worth, creating a downward spiral of artistic compromise and internal despair. By the end of the Glass Spider Tour in 1987, Bowie was exhausted, disillusioned, and according to multiple sources, deeply depressed. He'd achieved everything he thought he wanted in 1983. He'd proven he could dominate the charts, fill stadiums, be as big as any artist of his generation. He'd answered the question of his commercial viability with a resounding yes. But the answer had created a more terrifying question. If commercial success wasn't what gave his work meaning, what did? And had he spent the last 5 years running away from finding out? Something broke in late 1987. Bowie never specified exactly what triggered it. There was no dramatic incident, no public meltdown, no crystallizing moment. But by early 1988, people close to him noticed a shift. He stopped taking calls from his management about tour opportunities. He stopped doing interviews. He essentially disappeared from public view. What he was doing, though few people knew it at the time, was reassessing everything. He spent months alone, listening to his old albums, reading, painting, deliberately avoiding music industry people. He reconnected with artists he'd abandoned during his commercial period, Brian Eno, Tony Visconti, Robert Fripp. Not to work with them immediately, but simply to remember who he'd been before he started measuring his worth in platinum certifications. In a later interview from 1993, Bowie was remarkably candid about this period. I realized I'd been running an experiment on myself. I wanted to see if I could be a pure pop star, if I could just give people exactly what market research said they wanted. And I succeeded. But the experiment's conclusion was devastating. I could do it. But it made me into someone I didn't recognize or particularly like. He described looking at photographs from the Let's Dance era and feeling like he was looking at a stranger. The pastel suits, the choreographed dance moves, the carefully calculated commercial appeal. That person in those photos, he said, he's not me. He's a very well-executed forgery of me, created by someone who knew all my external characteristics, but none of my internal ones. But here's the moment of clarity that changed everything, the realization that would eventually lead Bowie back to artistic authenticity. He understood that commercial success hadn't corrupted him. He'd corrupted himself by believing that commercial success was something he needed to achieve rather than something that might happen as a byproduct of honest work. This distinction is crucial. Bowie didn't reject commercial success in principle. He rejected the idea that his worth as an artist was measured by it. He rejected the notion that he needed to prove anything to anyone, audiences, critics, the industry, or himself. He rejected the entire framework that had led him to make Let's Dance in the first place. The framework that said relevance was something you maintained through strategic career moves, rather than something that emerged organically from doing work that mattered to you. The result of this realization was Tin Machine, a hard rock band he formed in 1988 that deliberately rejected everything Let's Dance represented. No dance beats, no radio-friendly hooks, no attempt at commercial appeal whatsoever. The albums were raw, aggressive, often difficult to listen to. Critics were polarized. Commercial performance was modest at best, and Bowie didn't care. For the first time since Berlin, he was making music without constantly measuring it against commercial expectations. Was Tin Machine great? That's debatable, but it was necessary. It was Bowie tearing down the pop star infrastructure he'd built and starting over from scratch. The 1990s became Bowie's redemption arc, but not in the way most career redemption arcs work. He didn't have another massive commercial success that vindicated his earlier compromises. Instead, he gradually rebuilt his artistic identity by stopping caring about vindication entirely. Black Tie White Noise in 1993, Outside in 1995, Earthling in 1997. These albums varied wildly in style and commercial reception. Some sold well, some didn't. But they all shared something crucial. They felt like they came from a necessity, from an artist exploring ideas because he needed to explore them, not because market research suggested they might perform well. In a 1997 interview with Q magazine, Bowie reflected on the Let's Dance era with remarkable clarity. "I thought I needed to prove I could still matter commercially, but the real question I should have asked was, matter to whom, and for what reason? I spent 5 years trying to matter to everyone, and in the process, I stopped mattering to myself." That's the bargain you make when you prioritize commercial success over artistic honesty. You might gain the world, but you lose yourself in the process. He talked about the nightmares he'd had during the Serious Moonlight tour, waking up unable to remember why he was making the music he was making. He talked about the moment he realized that Let's Dance, for all its commercial success, had created absolutely no impact on music's artistic evolution. It had dominated charts and sold millions, but it hadn't pushed anything forward, hadn't challenged anyone, hadn't even challenged himself. "The albums I made in Berlin," he said, "they didn't sell as much as Let's Dance, but they changed how people thought about what rock music could be. They influenced generations of artists. 30 years from now, which matters more? I know the answer now. I wish I'd known it in 1983. But here's the most important lesson from Bowie's Let's Dance period. The insight that makes this more than just a cautionary tale about commercial compromise. Success isn't the problem. Defining yourself by success is the problem. Needing success to validate your worth is the problem. Believing that relevance is something you achieve rather than something you embody through honest work, that's the trap. Bowie didn't need to reject commercial success entirely to reclaim his artistic integrity. He needed to reject the psychological framework that made commercial success feel necessary. Once he did that, he was free. Free to make albums that sold or didn't sell. Free to experiment or play it safe. Free to follow his instincts without constantly measuring them against commercial outcomes. The final proof of this came with his last albums. The Next Day in 2013 and Black Star in 2016 were made with complete artistic freedom, with no concern for commercial performance. The Next Day became his first #1 album in the UK in 20 years. Black Star, released 2 days before his death, topped charts worldwide and received universal critical acclaim. But Bowie wasn't alive to see Black Star's success, and perhaps that's fitting. He made it without knowing how it would be received, without measuring it against any external standard. He made it because it was the work he needed to make, the statement he needed to leave. And that's what made it powerful. Not its commercial success, but its complete authenticity. Today, Let's Dance is remembered as one of Bowie's biggest albums, a defining sound of the 1980s, a commercial triumph. Music historians often frame it as his comeback, the moment he proved his lasting relevance. And in purely commercial terms, they're right. But within that success lies a deeper, more complex truth that Bowie himself understood and articulated in his later years. Let's Dance wasn't a triumph. It was a crisis disguised as a triumph. It was the moment when one of music's most innovative artists discovered that he could succeed wildly at being someone he wasn't, and that discovery nearly destroyed him. The real legacy of Let's Dance isn't the album itself. It's what happened after. The slow, painful process of Bowie reclaiming his artistic identity from the machinery of commercial success. It's watching an artist realize that the question isn't, can I still have hits? But rather, what am I trying to say? And am I saying it honestly? For every artist, there's a moment of temptation. The offer to make the commercially safe choice, to follow the formula, to give audiences exactly what market research says they want. Let's Dance represents what happens when you say yes to that temptation and discover that succeeding at it is worse than failing, because success makes the trap feel justified. But Bowie's ultimate legacy is that he found his way out. Not by denouncing Let's Dance or pretending it didn't happen, but by accepting it as part of his journey, learning from it, and spending the rest of his career doing work that mattered to him, regardless of whether it mattered commercially. In his final interview, recorded in 2015 for Black Star's release but not published until after his death, Bowie was asked if he had regrets about the Let's Dance period. His answer was nuanced. "I don't regret making it. I regret the 5 years afterward when I kept trying to recapture that commercial success, instead of asking myself why I needed it so desperately in the first place." That's the real danger of a big commercial hit. Not that it happens, but that you become addicted to making it happen again. And in that addiction, you lose sight of why you make music at all. He paused, then added, "But I needed to learn that lesson. I needed to discover that I could be commercially successful and still feel artistically empty. Because only after learning that could I make music without that fear of irrelevance poisoning every creative decision." And perhaps that's the most important insight from this chapter of Bowie's career. Success itself isn't the enemy of artistic integrity. The fear of lacking success is. The need to prove your relevance is. The belief that commercial validation determines your worth is. Those are the things that corrupt, that compromise, that turn artists into brands and inspiration into product. Bowie conquered those fears not by avoiding success, but by achieving it and realizing it didn't give him what he thought it would. He sold 10 million copies of Let's Dance and discovered that those 10 million copies couldn't answer the question that really mattered. Who am I when nobody's watching? And what do I have to say that needs to be said, regardless of whether anyone wants to hear it? That question, not Let's Dance, not the Serious Moonlight tour, not the commercial vindication, that question, and his willingness to spend the rest of his life answering it honestly, that's David Bowie's real legacy. Everything else, the sales figures and chart positions and stadium crowds, those are just footnotes to the more important story of an artist who got lost in success and found himself again by remembering that the only relevance that truly matters is relevance to yourself. The world remembers Let's Dance as a triumph. David Bowie remembered it as the moment he almost forgot why he made music in the first place. Both things can be true. And in that contradiction lies the entire complexity of what it means to be an artist in a commercial world, constantly navigating the tension between what audiences want and what you need to create, between success and integrity, between the person the world wants you to be and the person you actually are. Bowie spent 5 years getting that balance catastrophically wrong, but he spent the next 30 years getting it right. And that journey from compromise to authenticity, from commercial calculation to artistic honesty, from manufactured relevance to genuine self-expression, that's the real story behind Let's Dance. Not the album itself, but everything it revealed about success, artistry, and the courage required to choose meaning over metrics.